Rain drifted through the streets of Palermo like smoke escaping the earth. Every drop carried the weight of old confessions, whispering against stone and glass before breaking apart on the hood of a black Maserati parked beneath the streetlight. Inside sat the kind of silence that follows men who have lived too long with ghosts. Marco DeLuca watched the world through the smear of water on his windshield. The city pulsed in reflection, red lights bending through the rain, faces passing by without names. He liked it this way. Distance made it easier to breathe. Somewhere in the back of his mind he could still hear the music from that wedding years ago, the one that ended in gunfire and blood on white roses. That was the night he inherited an empire. That was the night he learned that love was a liability. He built his name the way a sculptor builds a statue, by cutting away everything soft. The DeLuca organization ran like clockwork, polished and merciless. His men obeyed because he never raised his voice. They feared the quiet more than bullets. In meetings, he spoke only when necessary. In the dark, he listened to the sea beating against the harbor walls and tried not to remember the sound of his father's heart stopping most nights. He didn't sleep. He sat in the corner of his penthouse, lights low, cigarette ember breathing like a small red wound. The city beneath him glittered, but it was a cold glitter. Money, blood, loyalty, betrayal. He had everything men killed for and nothing worth dying with. Then came the night at the charity gala. Gold chandeliers, laughter, the illusion of elegance that money buys when it wants to look clean. He walked in surrounded by bodyguards, every head turning as though gravity had shifted. Power does that to a room. But even power paused when she appeared. Elena moved through the crowd as though the music followed her. Not beautiful in the fragile way of porcelain, but alive in the dangerous way of flame. She was there to cover the event for a magazine. Notebook in one hand, champagne in the other, curiosity written across her face like light across water. Marco saw her before she saw him. Something in the tilt of her head, fearless, unguarded, broke through the armor he'd spent a lifetime building. He didn't approach. He just watched, memorizing the color of her dress, the rhythm of her laughter. For the first time in years, the noise of the room felt distant, the air less suffocating. Later that night when he returned home, he found her name printed at the bottom of an article about corruption in Sicilian business. The words were sharp, brave. She wrote about monsters without flinching, and somehow managed to make readers pity them. He read the piece twice, cigarette ash falling across the page, realizing he'd been described without being named. Days turned into weeks. Their paths crossed again. Coincidence arranged by fate or by something darker. She came to his office for an interview no one else would have dared to request. He agreed, not because he trusted her, but because curiosity is a weakness even kings possess. What began as questions and answers became something unspoken. She saw the human edges of him that even he had forgotten existed. In her presence, the air felt less heavy, the city less cruel. She never asked about his father, or the wedding, or the blood that still stained his name. She asked what he loved about the sea, what he thought about silence. Small things that sounded harmless but left him exposed. She would visit again and again under professional pretexts. Research, interviews, photographs. Each time, the distance between them shrank like fabric in rain. The men who guarded him pretended not to notice. They had seen what happens when their boss decides to care for something. They hoped she would never betray him, because they had also seen what happens when he decides to stop caring. Nights with her were quiet. No questions, no explanations. Just the hum of a record player and the faint scent of her perfume on the sheets. When she slept, he would study her face the way soldiers study a ceasefire, knowing it cannot last but still wishing it could. For a while, the world allowed them that illusion. Business stayed steady. Rivals remained cautious. The empire hummed beneath his fingertips like a machine well oiled by fear. And yet, somewhere between the boardrooms and the kisses, something began to change. He caught himself smiling once in a meeting. His men exchanged glances. One of them, the oldest, muttered that love makes kings mortal. Marco ignored him, But the words stuck. He began to imagine what it might be like to leave it all behind. The cars, the guns, the endless caution. He imagined a house by the water, mornings without guards at the gate, a future measured in laughter instead of ledgers. The thought frightened him more than death ever had. Elena became his sanctuary and his undoing. She challenged his control, teased the man out from behind the myth. She was not afraid of his silence. She filled it with warmth until even he began to believe he could be more than the name carved into fear. But love in his world was a debt that always came due. The first sign arrived like a whisper, a late reply to a message, a faint distance in her eyes. He told himself it was nothing, work, fatigue, imagination. Still, the nights grew longer, her laughter softer, her touch less certain. The same rain that once sounded like music now beat against his windows like warning. He found himself watching her more closely, reading meaning into every pause. Power had taught him to detect lies in breath and heartbeat. Love blinded him to both, and yet he felt the fracture forming. The city around them went on as always. Deals struck, favors traded, lives ended. But beneath the surface, a different story began to stir. One written not in bullets but in the quiet breaking of trust, and still, each evening, when the lights of Palermo shimmered on the wet streets below, he poured 2 glasses of wine and waited. For her voice at the door. For the sound of keys. For proof that love could live in a house built from fear. He never realized that in waiting, he was already losing her. Rain softened overnight, leaving Palermo smelling of salt and stone. By morning, light leaked through the blinds of Marco's penthouse, pale and uncertain. The city below stretched awake, unaware that the most powerful man in its underworld was sitting alone, staring into a glass that reflected nothing back at him. He had never been good at mornings. They brought too much silence. Nights were easier. They hid everything in shadow, and Marco had learned long ago that monsters look cleaner in the dark. But mornings made everything visible. The untouched half of the bed. The lipstick print fading from the rim of a glass. The echo of footsteps that no longer returned. He told himself she was busy. Journalists had deadlines, editors, stories. But somewhere behind that logic sat a truth he refused to touch. She had started drifting away, quietly, like smoke leaving a room before anyone notices the fire is gone. Work should have been distraction enough. There were shipments to check, accounts to settle, men to discipline. Yet none of it held him. He sat through meetings barely hearing the words. He signed documents without reading them. He watched his men study him when they thought he wasn't looking, searching for signs of weakness. In the afternoon he went to the harbor. His usual escape when the noise in his head became unbearable. The wind there carried the scent of diesel and salt, the smell of commerce and consequence. From the pier, he could see the cranes lifting containers that kept the DeLuca empire breathing. Each one carried secrets, debts, and the quiet promise of power. He used to find comfort in the rhythm of it all. Now it just felt endless. He stood there long after the others left, watching gulls circle the waves until dusk swallowed them whole. Somewhere behind him, the city lights flickered on like stars manufactured to remind men that the world keeps moving whether they want it to or not. That night he returned home early. The elevator ride to his penthouse felt longer than usual, the air thick with a stillness that wasn't peace. When the doors opened, the first thing he noticed was the absence of music. Elena always played something when she stayed there. Soft piano, low jazz, melodies that made the space human. He walked through the rooms quietly, each step echoing off marble and glass. Her scarf lay on the couch, her perfume lingered faintly in the air. But the apartment felt hollow, like a stage after the actors have left. He poured himself another drink. The whiskey burned going down, a small pain to remind him he was still capable of feeling something. Outside, the rain returned, tracing long, trembling lines down the windows. Palermo glowed beneath it, alive and indifferent. He thought about calling her. The phone sat on the table, screen dark, patient. He picked it up once, stared at her name, then put it down again. Pride was a colder cage than loneliness. Hours later, when sleep finally came, it was shallow and restless. His dreams bled with memories, laughter by candlelight, her hair damp from the rain, the way she once traced a scar on his shoulder as though it were a story she wanted to rewrite. He woke before dawn, heart pounding, realizing that even in dreams he couldn't escape the feeling that something precious was slipping away. The following days blurred together. Meetings, phone calls, endless movements of men and money. Yet beneath it all, there was the hum of uncertainty. He began to notice things. Her sudden changes in schedule, her evasive explanations, the hesitation in her smile. Tiny fractures that widened with every hour. He tried to ignore them, but the instincts that kept him alive for decades refused to sleep. Power had trained him to listen to silence more than words. Silence told the truth. And lately, Elena's silence screamed. One evening, when the sky over Palermo turned the color of bruised wine, Marco stood on the balcony watching headlights move like veins through the city. Somewhere out there she was walking, maybe laughing, maybe lying. The thought struck him with a quiet violence he didn't show. His driver asked if he needed the car. He nodded. 10 minutes later, the Maserati glided through the rain-slick streets, its reflection stretching across puddles like a shadow trying to escape itself. He didn't know where he was going until he arrived. Outside her apartment building, parked beneath a flickering streetlight, he waited. Cigarette after cigarette burned down to the filter, the smoke curling upward like questions with no answers. Time blurred. Then the door opened. Elena stepped out, wrapped in the red coat he'd bought her from Milan, the one she once said made her feel invincible. The sight of it made his chest tighten, a memory-turned weapon. She looked radiant, almost too much so, as though beauty itself were a disguise that a man followed her out. He was tall, wearing a dark coat, face half hidden beneath the umbrella he held over them both. They spoke softly, the kind of softness that intimacy allows. Then she laughed, a sound Marco hadn't heard in weeks. The laugh turned to poison in his ears. He watched as the man reached out and hugged her. Not a polite embrace. Not fleeting. Long enough for the world to tilt. Marco's hands rested still on his knees. Only his jaw moved, tightening until the muscles ached. His driver shifted in the seat beside him, unsure if breathing was still allowed. When she and the man finally parted ways, she walked down the street, unaware of the eyes following her through the glass. The car engine purred to life. The driver glanced at him for instruction, but the order never came. Marco stared straight ahead, voice calm and cold inside his head. He didn't need confirmation. Not yet. Not tonight. Some truths are worse when spoken aloud. He leaned back, closing his eyes as the rain thickened, the sound of it swallowing everything. Beneath the rhythm of thunder, his heart beat slow and heavy. Not with rage, but with something emptier, quieter. The beginning of loss. When he opened his eyes again, the street was empty. The door to her building had closed. Only the red of her coat lingered in his memory, bright as blood against the gray. The car rolled away through the wet streets, the city's reflection sliding across the windows like a film he couldn't stop watching. Inside, Marco sat still, a man trying to convince himself that betrayal was just another business decision waiting to be handled. But deep down he knew. Business never felt like this, and somewhere, in the soft rhythm of rain against glass, Palermo whispered a truth it had always known. Even the strongest men eventually kneel before something they cannot control. The night deepened, stretching across Palermo like a silk veil dipped in wine. Somewhere in the city, a violin cried, its notes climbing through apartment windows and into the dark lungs of the street. Marco drove without direction, the hum of the engine a low heartbeat beneath his thoughts. His men followed at a respectful distance, shadows trailing a ghost. He didn't go home, he rarely did. The mansion on the hill was too clean, too silent. It smelled of marble and dust, not of life. So he drove through the sleeping streets until the glow of the port lights rose ahead, soft and golden. Brushing the sea with trembling hands, he stopped at the docks. There, among the stacks of containers and the whisper of water, he stood and watched the horizon, the place where the city lights drowned in salt. That was where he came to think. That was where ghosts gathered. He thought of his father, of the way the man's ring shone under the dim chandelier as he poured another glass of whiskey. He thought of the sound of the gunshot that ended the DeLuca patriarch's reign, and how Marco's life split cleanly in two, before the blood and after. He thought of the promise he made to himself that night, a promise carved into the flesh of his heart, Never again weakness, never again mercy. The water lapped at the pier's edge, patient and cold. Marco slipped a cigarette between his lips but never lit it. He liked the ritual, not the smoke. In the distance, thunder rumbled, rain began to fall. Slow at first, then harder, turning the pier into a mirror of rippling gold and shadow. He didn't move, he let it soak him. The suit, the hair, the silence, somewhere behind him. Headlights sliced through the rain. A car door opened. Footsteps. "Boss," came a low voice. "We found her." Marco turned, rain dripping down his jaw. His men stood there, their faces half lit by the trembling light. "Where?" he asked. The man hesitated. "A small cafe on Via Messina. She works there." The faintest flicker crossed Marco's expression. Not surprise, not curiosity, something quieter, almost human. He nodded once. "Tomorrow." The man stepped back. The engine started again. The car rolled away. Marco stayed by the sea, watching the line where night and water became one, and the whisper of the storm. Something inside him shifted. Something he couldn't name. He didn't know yet that tomorrow would begin the unraveling. That the woman in the cafe would become the first crack in the empire he built with blood. He didn't know her name, but the city already did. Elena Rossi, 26. Waitress. Dreamer, a woman who wrote poems in the back of receipts, who believed kindness still had power in a world built on smoke and guns. While Marco stared at the sea, Elena was cleaning tables. Her hands rough from soap and late hours. She moved like someone who didn't belong in the noise of the city. Too soft for its sharp corners, too bright for its grays outside. The rain tapped against the cafe windows, and she looked up, her eyes following the storm like it was speaking to her. Maybe it was she. Had no idea that somewhere a man like Marco DeLuca was already on his way into her story, and that when he arrived nothing, not Palermo, not her dreams, not even her soul, would be the same again. Morning unfolded in a soft blur of gold and gray. Palermo woke to the scent of rain-soaked earth and freshly ground coffee. Shutters opened one by one, revealing the city's bruised beauty. Laundry lines swaying, vendors shouting. The hum of traffic rising like a heartbeat beneath the clouds. Narrow street off Via Messina, Cafe Rosetta came alive. The bell above the door chimed each time a customer entered. Its sound sweet and fragile. Like a note too innocent for this city, Elena moved between tables with quiet grace, a simple beige dress, a white apron tied at her waist, her hair in a messy knot that no mirror had tamed. Her smile wasn't loud. It was the kind that lingered softly, like sunlight on glass. The regulars, she was part of the place. The warmth in the corner, the reason coffee tasted a little kinder outside. A black car rolled to a slow stop. The street seemed to hesitate when the door opened. Silence slipped in with a man who stepped out. He wasn't dressed to belong here. His suit was too fine, his walk too certain. His eyes too still. Marco DeLuca didn't need to announce who he was. The city knew men like him by the quiet they carried. He pushed open the cafe door, and the bell above it chimed once. Sharp, almost nervous heads turned. Conversations paused. Elena glanced up, holding a tray of steaming cups, and for a heartbeat, she froze. The man who entered didn't belong to her world. There was something in his face. A kind of danger that wasn't loud, but deep like the tide before a storm, and yet, something in his eyes, dark, unreadable, felt like sorrow that had forgotten how to cry. Their gazes met, just a second, but in that second, the air changed. He sat by the window, his back straight, his gaze fixed on the rain. Outside. Elena exhaled quietly and moved toward him, tray in hand. "Good morning," she said softly, though her voice trembled like the edge of a page. "Coffee?" He nodded once, no words. She poured it. Slow, careful. The cup clinked lightly against the saucer, the sound almost tender. Marco's eyes lifted to her hand. Slender, steady, graceful in its smallness. He noticed the faint red mark from a burn near her wrist, and he wondered, for the first time in years, how pain could still look so gentle. Elena stepped back, unsure why her heart felt unsteady. She didn't know who he was, only that he didn't feel like any man she'd ever served coffee to. Marco watched her walk away, the rhythm of her movement, the quiet strength beneath her softness. He didn't smile, he only said under his breath, almost to himself, "Fire and silk." He didn't know where the words came from, but they stayed with him. Outside, thunder whispered again, as if the city itself was aware of what had just begun, the smallest spark in a place built to burn. For the first time in years, Marco didn't return to his office immediately. He stayed. He ordered another coffee he barely touched, watching her, memorizing the light that fell across her face when she laughed with another customer. He didn't know why. He only knew that he was no longer entirely in control of his own silence, and Elena. She felt it too, though she couldn't name it, the strange gravity of a man she didn't know, the quiet pull of a story that hadn't yet been written but had already begun to write her outside. The rain eased inside, something else began to fall, slowly, invisibly. Like ash from a fire they hadn't yet set. The next day the rain returned, soft, hesitant, as if unsure whether Palermo deserved another. Cleansing. The sea beyond the harbor moved like smoke under the clouds, and in his penthouse above the city, Marco DeLuca sat in front of an untouched breakfast, staring at the skyline that no longer felt like his. He had built this empire on fear, on rules, on precision. Every brick of the DeLuca name was held together by silence. The kind of silence that made men disappear, the kind that could break loyalty like glass. But now, somewhere between the click of his cufflinks and the whisper of thunder, outside, he was thinking about a woman pouring coffee in a narrow street. He told himself it was nothing, a flicker, a distraction. But distractions were dangerous things for men like him. They had a way of turning into weaknesses. By noon, he found himself driving down via Messina again. He didn't know why. He wasn't a man who repeated places, unless it was for business or blood. The cafe was quieter this time. Elena was behind the counter, her hair loose today, curls framing her face when she saw him step in. Her eyes widened slightly. Recognition, surprise, something else she couldn't name. The bell chimed again, softer this time. He sat at the same table by the window. She walked toward him, trying not to stare but failing. "You came back," she said, her voice low, uncertain whether to smile. He nodded once, his tone steady. The coffee was good. That was all, and yet, it was enough to make something flicker between them again. Something invisible, but alive. Days became patterns. Patterns became habits, and habits, for a man like Marco, were dangerous. He began showing up at the cafe almost every afternoon. Never at the same hour, never with company. He would sit by the window, sometimes reading, sometimes watching the rain, sometimes saying nothing at all. And always Elena was there. The quiet pulse of his afternoons. She didn't know who he was, not really, but she could tell he wasn't ordinary. His watch, his shoes, his posture, all whispered of a world she didn't belong to yet. When he spoke, his voice was calm, respectful, even kind. She began to notice small things. The way he listened, even when he didn't ask. The way he looked at people, not with judgment but with quiet calculation, and the way his eyes softened, just barely, whenever they met hers. He asked her once, "Do you ever get tired of this place?" She smiled. "Sometimes. But I like watching people come and go. They all leave a little story behind." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was polite. "Maybe that's why I keep coming back." Elena laughed softly, though her chest felt strangely tight. He said it so simply, like it meant nothing, yet everything. Evening, the city outside was golden. The sun slipped behind the domes, and Palermo exhaled its slow, aching beauty. She watched him stand, leave money on the table, too much as always, and step out into the fading light. He didn't look back, but she did. And that night, lying awake in her small apartment, Elena found herself wondering who he really was, and why she couldn't stop replaying the sound of his voice. Marco, too, couldn't escape the echo in his world of weapons and whispered power. Her name had become the only thing that softened the edges of his thoughts. It terrified him more than any gun ever could. That he tried to bury it. He told himself she was just another passerby in a life too dangerous for warmth. But when dawn came, he caught himself thinking of her again, and he realized with quiet dread that he was already losing. Men like Marco DeLuca didn't fall in love, they only fell into silence, into mistakes, into the kind of ruin that didn't bleed until it was too late. And somewhere in the narrow streets of Palermo, beneath a hanging line of white sheets fluttering in the wind, the universe smiled. Because even the strongest walls eventually crack. Whispers began before the truth had a chance to breathe. Men in suits noticed first, the ones who stood beside him at meetings, who guarded his doors, who learned never to question the quiet between his words. Marco DeLuca was changing. Not in ways they could name, but in the subtle cracks that appeared in his rhythm, the late arrivals, the distant stares, the way he'd go missing for an hour in the middle of the day, returning with rain on his coat and calm in his eyes. They didn't dare ask where he went, but they wondered. And the DeLuca family, Curiosity could be fatal still in the back of his black Maserati. His driver noticed how his boss stared out the window when they passed via Messina once. He saw Marco's lips move slightly, as if whispering a name. He didn't say a word. He only gripped the steering wheel tighter and prayed he'd never have to know what that name meant. And the cafe, the world remained small and bright. Elena moved through her days as though time was a quiet river, each shift flowing into the next. She'd begun to expect him. Not hope, not wait, but expect, the way one expects the sun to break through clouds after rain. And each time he came, the world outside seemed to pause, as if Palermo itself held its breath for them. He didn't talk much. She didn't ask much. Yet in the space between their silences, something vast grew. Something too tender for the life he led, too dangerous for the life she knew. Sometimes he'd bring her small things, a book, the pages worn, smelling faintly of salt and smoke, a single white rose wrapped in paper, once a silver lighter, engraved with her initials before she ever told him her full name. "Why?" she'd ask, smiling but wary, and he'd just say, "Because I wanted to." No promises, no explanations, just gestures. Quiet, deliberate, unforgettable. He began to learn her rhythms, that she always hummed softly while cleaning the counter, that she took her coffee black when she was tired, that she looked out the window every time it rained. Her eyes somewhere far away. He didn't know what haunted her, but he knew something did, and he respected the silence she wrapped around it. Elena, too, began to see beyond the shadows he carried. She saw the way he touched things. Careful, almost reverent, as if the world had taught him to fear breaking anything fragile. She saw the loneliness in his stillness, the exhaustion in his grace. Once, when she served him coffee, she said quietly, "You look like a man who hasn't slept in years." He looked at her, really looked, and for a moment it seemed like he might say something honest. Instead, he took the cup, sipped, and replied, "Some nights don't end when the sun comes up." That was the closest he'd ever come to telling her the truth. But the city always listens, and Palermo, with all its secrets, began to murmur. Rumors slipped through alleys and wine bars, about a girl from Cafe Rosetta, and the man who came every afternoon in a black car. Whispers reached men who shouldn't hear them, enemies, rivals, and one night, even his own consigliere spoke. "Marco," he said carefully, "the men are starting to ask questions. You disappear too often. They say there's a woman." Marco didn't look up from his glass of bourbon. "And do you believe them?" The man hesitated. "It's not about belief. It's about control." Marco smiled, a small, cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Control," he said softly, "is knowing what not to kill." The room went silent, and with that, the matter was closed. But that night when he went home, he stood by his window, watching the city lights blur through the rain. For the first time, he wondered what kind of man he was becoming. The kind who protected his empire, or the kind who let it burn for something softer. Below that same sky, Elena lay awake, thinking about him. Not because of what he gave her, but because of what he didn't. Explanations, labels, reasons. He existed like a secret she couldn't help but want to keep, and somewhere between midnight and dawn, both of them made the same silent wish, that the world would stop long enough for them to just breathe in the same moment, without fear, without names, without consequence. But the world never stops for men like Marco DeLuca. It only slows, just enough for love to find its way in, before it's forced to pay the price. The sky that week was painted in smoke and salt. The rain had eased, but Palermo still smelled like storms. Every street shimmered faintly, as though the city had just survived something. And maybe it had. Marco sat in the back seat of his Maserati, the hum of the engine drowning out the sound of his thoughts. He hadn't planned to see her again that night, but plans had never stood a chance against whatever pull she had on him. A man like him was supposed to live in the rhythm of control. Meetings, deals, decisions made in shadows. But lately, all his certainties had begun to feel like cages. He told his driver to take a turn off the main road. No destination, just instinct, and instinct led him once again to her street. He parked a few buildings away from the cafe. The lights were still on through the window. He saw her, wiping tables, hair loose, a quiet hum escaping her lips. He didn't go in, he just watched. Something about the simplicity of her movements, the peace in her small world, made him ache in places he didn't know still existed. She didn't know she was saving him, not from enemies but from himself. The next day, she found a note slipped under the cafe door. Just her name, written in ink she didn't recognize, inside a line. Dinner. Bella Luna. M. She read it twice, her heart fluttering like a trapped bird. She didn't know whether to be afraid or curious, or both. That evening, she stood before her mirror, uncertain. Her hands trembled as she fastened the clasp of her necklace. She chose a simple silver dress, the one that made her feel calm, not beautiful, because calm was safer. La Bella Luna sat near the harbor, a restaurant wrapped in candlelight and murmured secrets. When she arrived, the maitre d' guided her to a private table, overlooking the dark water. And there he was. Marco rose when she approached, his gaze steady, his presence filling the air like thunder held just beneath the skin of the night. He pulled out her chair, a small gesture, yet impossibly gentle for the man the city whispered about. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I almost didn't," she admitted. "I know." They spoke like two people balancing on the edge of something too fragile to name. The waiter brought wine. Candles flickered, the world outside dimmed until there was nothing left but them. Elena told him about her childhood, the books she used to steal from her father's library, her love for the sea, her fear of staying in one place too long. Marco listened, saying little, but his eyes never left her face when she asked about him. He hesitated. There were 1,000 things he could never tell her. The blood, the bargains, the ghosts that wore his last name. "I run a family business," he said finally, the corner of his mouth tightening slightly. She smiled faintly. "That sounds complicated." "It is. Do you love it?" He looked at her, and something like truth slipped into his voice. "I don't know if love is the right word for the thing that owns you." For a long time they just sat there, the silence between them heavy but not cold. It felt like standing at the edge of a confession neither was brave enough to make. Later, when she excused herself, Marco watched her walk toward the door, her silhouette framed by candlelight, and for a fleeting second, he imagined what it would be like if the world were simple, if he could meet her without the weight of the DeLuca name behind his shadow. But simplicity wasn't part of his story. He knew that the moment she turned, smiled softly and said, "Thank you for tonight." He nodded. "It won't be the last." She wanted to believe him, but something in his tone sounded like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Outside, the sea sighed against the docks, restless and endless, the kind of sound that makes you realize nothing good can last forever. From a car parked across the street, two men watched them leave. They didn't speak. They didn't need to point. One of them lifted a phone, sent a single message. "He's slipping." The message traveled fast. In Marco's world, every whisper was a weapon. By morning, that single text had crossed 3 borders and 4 time zones, landing in the inbox of a man who smiled when he read it, Giovanni Vitali. Once Marco's ally, now his shadow. The kind that followed even when you ran from the light. He had waited years for a sign of weakness, and now he smelled it, a woman. There was always a woman. Diane, the marble stillness of his office. Giovanni poured himself a drink and murmured, "Love makes men foolish. Even kings." Across the city, the day unfolded with deceptive peace. Elena woke to the hum of life outside her window, the chatter of markets, the distant echo of church bells. She smiled without realizing why. Something inside her had shifted since that dinner. She wasn't naive. She knew men like Marco came with secrets, but she'd also seen something behind his silence, a flicker of humanity, like a candle trapped in stone. And though she told herself to be careful, her heart didn't listen. When she reached the cafe, a bouquet of white roses waited by the counter. No card, no note, just the scent of something rare. The old barista Sophia raised an eyebrow. "From your secret admirer?" Elena laughed softly, pretending not to blush. "Maybe just a kind customer." But she knew, and she hated that she liked it. That evening Marco came again, not to the cafe, to the pier. He stood at the edge of the dock, the water glimmering black beneath the lamps. His mind was a storm of contradictions. He'd built his empire by staying cold, untouchable, yet with her. He couldn't find the edges of his own control. He didn't notice the man watching from across the street, one of Giovanni's. Camera in hand. Click. Click. Each photograph a thread in the noose being woven around his heart. Later that week, Marco invited her for a drive. No destination, just escape. The city rolled past them. Golden stone, narrow turns, laundry fluttering between balconies like white flags. Elena's laughter filled the car, warm and unguarded. "You drive like you're trying to outrun something," she said. He glanced at her, lips curving faintly. "Maybe I am." "What?" "Everything." She smiled at the honesty she didn't expect. Then you're not the only one. They drove to the cliffs outside Palermo, the kind of place where the sea met the sky with no witnesses. They sat on the hood, wind in their hair, the sound of waves breaking like secrets too old to hide. For a while, there were no words, and that silence, that pure, dangerous silence, said more than anything either could have confessed. Marco looked at her profile against the dying light. He didn't touch her, didn't dare, but in that moment, he knew something irreversible had happened. He'd crossed the line between the man he had to be and the one he wanted to be. That night, when he dropped her off, she lingered by the car door. Her fingers brushed the edge of the window. "Be careful, Marco," she whispered. "I don't know why, but I feel like you live close to something that doesn't forgive." He met her eyes, dark, steady. "I do. And that's why I shouldn't see you again." She froze. The air thickened with a kind of silence that hurts, but before she could speak, he started the engine, and with that, he was gone. Headlights vanishing into the dark, leaving her standing there under the streetlight, her reflection trembling on the wet pavement, inside the car. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. He didn't look back, because if he did, he wouldn't be able to leave by dawn. The photographs had reached Giovanni's desk, Marco and Elena. The cliffs, the car. Giovanni smiled again, slow, venomous. He poured another drink and whispered to no one. Even lions forget to guard their throats when they start to dream. 3 nights later, Palermo's air felt heavier, like the city itself sensed something coming. Elena sat in her small apartment, sorting through a box of old files she hadn't opened in years, her journalist days. The ones she promised herself she'd left behind. But curiosity was a habit that never truly died. She wasn't sure why she'd opened that box again. Maybe it was the way Marco's eyes lingered when he thought she wasn't watching, or the way his name carried weight in whispers. A man like that didn't just own a business, he owned silence, and silence always had a cost. She flipped through old articles, investigations into corruption, missing money, names tied to blood. Then one caught her eye. A photo from 5 years ago, a younger Marco standing beside another man, Giovanni Vitali. Her breath. So that was it. That was the shadow she felt every time he looked away. That same moment, across the city, Giovanni sat in a dim warehouse with 2 men. His lieutenants. On the table lay the photos of Marco and Elena. He tapped his finger against one image, the one of Marco's hand brushing her hair away from her face. "She's not just some girl," Giovanni said coldly. "She's the knife." He's too blind to see it. One of the men frowned. "You think she's working for someone?" Giovanni leaned forward. "No, worse. She makes him human." He smirked. "And that's how you kill a man like Marco. You don't shoot him. You make him feel." Meanwhile, Marco's nights grew quieter. No business meetings, no calls, no blood. Just silence and the echo of her voice in his head. He told himself staying away would keep her safe. But that lie began to rot the longer it sat inside him. By the 5th night, he couldn't take it anymore. He drove to her apartment, no plan. Just need. When she opened the door, surprise flickered in her eyes, followed by something softer. "Marco? I need to talk," he said. His voice was rough, almost desperate. She stepped aside. The apartment was small, warm, the kind of space that felt real, untouched by luxury. He stood by the window, unable to find words. Finally she spoke. "I saw an old photo today. You and Giovanni Vitali." He froze. Oh, she knew. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. "Who are you, really?" He met her eyes, and for once the truth didn't hide. "The man you think I am. I killed him a long time ago." She swallowed. "And the one standing in front of me now?" He stepped closer, voice low. "He's trying to find a reason to live differently. You're that reason." Her breath caught. But before she could respond, the window behind her shattered, a single bullet slicing the air between them. Marco tackled her to the floor as glass rained around them. Another shot. Then silence, only the pounding of their hearts. He pressed her close, eyes scanning the dark street outside. Whoever fired didn't miss. They just meant to warn. Elena trembled. "What is happening, Marco?" He clenched his jaw. "The past," he said quietly, "just found me." He pulled out his phone, typing something fast, a code to his men, a signal for lockdown. Then he looked at her, face hard but eyes burning. "You can't stay here anymore. Pack what you can. You're leaving with me. I'm not going anywhere until you tell me the truth. He hesitated, just long enough for her to see the war behind his eyes. Finally, he said it. Giovanni wants to destroy me. And now, he'll use you to do it. The city bled into night. Rain whispered against the rooftops as Marco and Elena slipped through the back alley of her apartment, shadows folding around them like a cloak. His men waited in a black car 2 streets away, engines low, eyes sharp. When the doors shut, the world outside dissolved, replaced by the hum of the tires and the storm chasing them down every corner. Elena clutched her small bag to her chest, her pulse still wild. She could taste fear in the back of her throat, bitter and electric. But when she looked at Marco, calm, unshaken, his jaw clenched with quiet fury, the fear changed. It wasn't just terror anymore. It was fascination. She had written about men like him once, untouchable kings of the underworld, all power and sin, but none of her words had ever captured this part. The silence between his breaths, the weight he carried like an invisible wound. The car swerved sharply, breaking her thoughts. "We're not going home, are we?" she asked. No, his voice was gravel, deep and steady. "You don't have a home anymore. Not until this is over." Her throat tightened. "And when will that be?" He didn't answer. Outside, the storm deepened. Palermo blurred past, streets glistening under flickering lights, walls smeared with graffiti, the soul of a city that never slept. Then the car slowed near the harbor. A warehouse loomed ahead, old and abandoned. Marco stepped out first, scanning the shadows. His men followed, weapons drawn, eyes alert. Then he opened the door for her. Inside, the space smelled of metal and sea. Rain dripped from holes in the ceiling, echoing softly in the dark. He led her to a small office at the back, the only place with light. A single bulb swaying from a rusted wire. She looked around, trying to breathe through the tension. "So this is your idea of safe?" "It's off the grid," he said. "No one will find you here." She let out a shaky laugh. "You mean no one will find us?" He turned toward her slowly. There was something in his eyes then, not the cold precision of a mafia boss, but something raw, almost fragile. "Elena," he said, voice low, "I didn't want this for you." She stepped closer, rain still glistening on her hair. "Then why me?" He exhaled. "Because when I saw you, I remembered what peace looked like. And I've been at war too long." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. The storm outside became a heartbeat, steady and distant. She wanted to say something, to ask what kind of man confessed peace while carrying blood on his hands, but the words died before reaching her lips. Instead, she just stood there, staring at the man who looked more haunted than dangerous. Then her phone buzzed. A message. She froze. Marco's hand reached for the device instantly, but she'd already seen the name. Giovanni Vitali. The message was short. "He's lying to you, Elena. Ask him what really happened to your brother." Her breath stopped. Her brother, Luca, gone for 3 years, missing after investigating a crime ring tied to the DeLuca name. She looked at Marco and suddenly, every piece of safety shattered into glass. He saw the change in her eyes, the distance forming, the quiet disbelief. He didn't ask what the message said. He already knew Giovanni's methods. "Elena," he started, but she stepped back. "Don't." Her voice was sharp now, trembling with both pain and fury. "Tell me, Marco. Did you know him? Did you know my brother?" He closed his eyes. The silence said everything. The rain hammered the roof, louder now, like the city itself was holding its breath. "Answer me," she screamed. "Yes," he said finally. Her world collapsed with that single word. Tears welled in her eyes, not from fear this time but betrayal. "What did you do to him?" Marco looked at her, his face carved in guilt and stormlight. "I tried to save him." "Save him?" Her laugh broke. "From what you?" He took a step forward, but she backed away, shaking her head. "I warned him to stop digging," he said. "Giovanni wanted him dead. I couldn't protect him in time." "Liar." Her voice cracked. "You're all the same. You kill, you destroy, and then you tell yourself it was to save someone." He didn't defend himself. He didn't move. He just stood there, taking her words like bullets he knew he deserved. When she finally turned away, he whispered, "I'd trade every drop of power I have if it could bring him back." But she was already gone, Out into the rain, into the darkness that swallowed the city whole. The rain had not stopped. It fell like penance, washing over the marble facades of Palermo and down its narrow veins, the city bleeding silver beneath the moonlight. Marco watched from the doorway of the warehouse as Elena vanished into the distance. Her red coat a dying flame swallowed by darkness. For a long while he didn't move, he just stood there, his breath fogging the air, his chest heavy with something deeper than regret. A silence that had no name. When he finally spoke, it wasn't to anyone in particular. She knows. His men exchanged glances but said nothing. They had seen their boss enraged, ruthless, unshaken by death, but never like this tonight. Marco DeLuca didn't look like a king, he looked like a man who'd lost the only war that ever mattered. He walked back inside, the light flickered. He poured himself a glass of wine, hands trembling slightly as he brought it to his lips. "She'll run to Vitali," he murmured. "Find her," he ordered suddenly. "But no harm. No eyes on her unless I say so." The men nodded and disappeared into the storm. Marco sat, staring at the drops racing down the window. Giovanni Vitali, a name that tasted of ash. Once, they had been allies, bound by a pact written in blood and betrayal. Giovanni had ambition. Marco had the empire. Together they had ruled the city's underworld like twin storms, until greed split the sky between them. Vitali had made his move the night Marco's father died. The wedding massacre. A celebration turned to carnage, the air thick with roses and gunpowder. Vitali had promised peace that night. Instead, he'd delivered death now, years later. His ghost had crawled back through the cracks, whispering poison into Elena's heart. Marco crushed the glass in his hand. Blood mixed with wine, and still he didn't flinch. Across the city, Elena stumbled through the alleys, soaked to the bone, her mind a storm of questions and disbelief. The streets blurred. Her tears, the rain, the memory of his face. Marco's eyes had been too calm, too broken to be a lie, and yet, the message from Giovanni still burned in her mind like fire. "Ask him what really happened to your brother." She reached a small cafe near Via Roma, closed for the night, but the back door creaked open with a push. Inside, the darkness smelled of coffee and ghosts. She sat on the floor, shaking, trying to breathe. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. "He'll never tell you the truth, Elena. Meet me. Midnight." The old theater, her heart pounded. Giovanni Vitali, a man whispered about in headlines, the phantom behind half of Palermo's disappearances. If her brother Luca had died because of Marco, then maybe Giovanni held the proof. She looked out the window. Lightning split the sky, and she whispered to herself, "God forgive me, but I need to know." Midnight came. The theater stood like a corpse, once golden, now draped in dust and cobwebs. The grand chandelier hung low, shards of crystal catching what little light the storm allowed. Elena pushed the door open. It groaned like an old wound. A man waited in the orchestra pit, his suit immaculate, his smile too precise. Giovanni Vitali, tall, sharp, the kind of man who looked born in expensive lies. "Elena Rossi," he greeted, voice smooth as smoke. "Journalist. Lover of the infamous Marco DeLuca. You have your brother's eyes." She swallowed, fists tight. "You knew him." "I did more than that," he said. "I tried to save him." Her breath hitched. "Save him? From who?" Giovanni stepped closer, shadows licking the edges of his face. "From Marco." The words hit her like a gunshot. "He discovered something," Giovanni continued. "A shipment. Drugs hidden inside containers DeLuca claimed were legitimate imports. Luca wanted to expose it. That I told him to stop. But he wouldn't listen." Her eyes widened. "You're lying." Giovanni smiled faintly. "Am I?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a small flash drive. "Here's what your brother died for." She stared at it, trembling. "What's on it?" "Proof." His eyes glinted. "And something else, the truth about the man you love." She didn't take it immediately. Part of her wanted to throw it away, to pretend none of this existed. But curiosity, the same force that once made her a journalist, she reached out. "Careful," Giovanni said, pulling back slightly. "Once you see what's inside, there's no unseeing it." She snatched it from his hand anyway. "I don't scare that easily." He smiled. "I know. That's why Marco fell for you." Outside, a pair of eyes watched from across the street. Silent, hidden in the rain. Marco's driver, Rocco, whispered into a radio. She's here. With Vitali. On the other end, silence. Then Marco's voice, calm, lethal. Don't approach. I'm coming. He tossed his coat aside, grabbed his gun and stepped into the storm. His car roared to life like thunder. The DeLuca lion was awake again. The Maserati's headlights sliced through the rain, painting the wet streets in white fire. Marco drove alone. His hands locked on the wheel. His mind a labyrinth of rage and heartbreak. Each street he passed whispered memories, laughter echoing from a time when love had almost tamed him, but love, he knew now, was just another battlefield, and tonight the war had found its heart. The old theater rose like a ghost from the dark, marble cracked, ivy clawing its sides, the name Teatro di Palermo fading beneath decades of rain. Marco stopped the car a block away. The storm was louder now, as though heaven itself had come to witness. He stepped out, the wind whipping through his coat, lightning flashed, catching the silver of his gun inside, faint light bled through broken windows. The glow of betrayal waiting to be faced. He didn't rush, he walked. Each step was measured, precise, heavy with purpose. The sound of his shoes echoed like distant thunder in the hollowed streets. Inside the theater, Giovanni's words coiled around Elena like smoke. He stood near the stage, perfectly still, while she held the flash drive like it was burning her hand. "Plug it into your laptop," he said softly. "You'll see what he's hiding." She hesitated. "Why are you doing this?" "Because truth," Giovanni said, smiling faintly, "is the only weapon that still kills slowly." Elena's lips trembled. "And what do you get from this?" He shrugged. "Freedom. Power. Maybe peace." He looked up at the cracked ceiling, where rain leaked through like veins of silver. "I gave Marco everything once. Loyalty. Brotherhood. He gave me a bullet in return." Her heart thudded. "You tried to kill him at the wedding." Giovanni's smile didn't fade. "Did I? Or did he tell you that because it's easier to hate me than to admit what he did?" He took a step closer. "Your brother found something in Marco's shipment that night. Not drugs, Elena. Documents. Files that linked the DeLuca family to government contracts, bribed politicians, secret accounts. Your brother was going to publish them." She stared at him, unable to speak. "He never got the chance," Giovanni said. "Because Marco's men intercepted him. They took him to the docks." He leaned forward, his voice now a whisper. "Ask yourself, Elena, who controls the docks?" The words lodged like ice in her chest. She backed away, shaking her head. No, Marco wouldn't. The heavy doors of the theater slammed open. The sound boomed like thunder. Rain poured in behind him as Marco DeLuca entered. Soaked, breath steady, eyes burning. The gun in his hand gleamed beneath the fractured light. "Step away from her," he said quietly. Giovanni turned, slow, smiling like a man who had been waiting for this moment all his life. "Ah, the king himself. I was wondering when you'd join us." Elena froze between them, two worlds colliding before her eyes. Her heart raced. She didn't know who to believe anymore. "Tell her the truth, Giovanni," Marco said, voice low but trembling at the edges. "Tell her how you used her brother. How you promised him protection, then handed him over when he got too close." Giovanni laughed softly. "Still rewriting history, I see." Marco stepped forward, his presence filling the room like a storm. "You think I don't know what you're doing? You've been feeding her lies since the day you found her. You sent that message. You made sure she doubted me." Elena's voice cracked. "Then tell me the truth, Marco. Did you kill Luca?" The silence that followed was unbearable. The rain, the creaking theater, the thud of her heartbeat. Everything waited. Marco looked at her, his eyes raw and honest. "I didn't kill him." "Then what happened?" He lowered the gun slightly. "Your brother stole a shipment, not drugs, not money, but documents. Giovanni's documents. He was working for both sides, trying to expose the corruption in this city. But Giovanni found out first. I sent my men to bring him in, to protect him. When they got there, the place was already burning." He glanced at Giovanni, fury cutting through his words. "Your men shot him before mine even arrived." Giovanni's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened. "You think she'll believe that?" I don't care if she does, Marco said, voice breaking. It's the truth. Elena stood there, caught between two storms. Her hand trembled as she held the flash drive, still glistening under the dim light. Then what's this? She asked, whispering. What's on it? Marco's gaze shifted to it, a shadow crossing his face. That, he said, is the real reason Luca died. Giovanni's smirk faded. Marco took a step closer to Elena. Don't open it, he warned. Whatever's inside, it's what Giovanni wants. It'll start another war. And this time, no one will survive it. Elena looked between them. One man holding a gun, the other holding the truth, or maybe both holding lies. The rain howled outside. And before anyone could move, Giovanni whispered, "Too late." He pressed a small button on his phone. The stage lights flickered. Then a giant screen lowered from above, and the theater came alive with ghosts. Footage played, grainy. Shaky. A warehouse, flames, shouts, and a voice that sounded unmistakably like Marco's, shouting orders. Don't let him leave. Take him down. Elena's breath caught. The screen showed a gunshot. Then Luca falling, her brother, collapsing under a shower of sparks and fire. Marco's world shattered in the same instant. He took a step forward, eyes wide. That's not real. It's been cut. That's not. Giovanni smiled in silence. Elena dropped the flash drive, her knees weak. Stop, Marco whispered. Elena, listen to me. He's lying. That footage. She raised her hand. Don't. Her voice broke. Just don't. Tears slid down her face, and then she ran again, out into the storm, the sound of her footsteps echoing like heartbreak across the marble floor. Marco stood frozen. Giovanni's laughter followed her out into the rain. You can't outrun the past, DeLuca, he said. You built it with your own hands. Marco turned toward him, slow, dangerous, silent. Lightning flashed, the gun rose. Giovanni's smile finally vanished. The thunder swallowed the city whole. The old theater shuddered as the storm deepened, as though Palermo itself trembled at what was about to happen inside its ruined heart. Marco stood in the center of the stage, gun raised, his chest heaving, not from fear, but from the weight of too many ghosts. Giovanni Vitali faced him, smiling faintly, one hand still holding his phone, the other tucked casually in his pocket between them. Rain bled through a crack in the roof, dripping onto the floor in rhythm, a clock counting down to something inevitable. Go ahead, Giovanni said, voice calm. Pull the trigger, DeLuca. That's what you do best. Marco's finger hovered over the trigger. I've killed men for less. Then do it, Giovanni whispered. But she'll never forgive you. Marco's jaw clenched, the words sliced deeper than the threat ever could. He could still see her, Elena, running into the rain, her red coat bleeding into the night, her sobs dissolving with the thunder. She'll know the truth someday, Marco said through his teeth. Giovanni laughed quietly. Oh, she already does. You just refuse to admit it. He tilted his head. You think you're the hero of this story, Marco. But you're not. You're the villain who fell in love. And now you're paying for it. The flash of lightning turned the stage white. Marco fired. The bullet ripped through Giovanni's shoulder, spinning him backward against a column. He let out a low, guttural laugh even as blood poured from the wound. Still the same, Giovanni hissed. Always shooting before thinking. Marco strode toward him, eyes blazing. You talk too much. He grabbed Giovanni by the collar, slamming him against the wall. Tell me where she's going. Giovanni smirked through the pain. Somewhere safe. Somewhere you can't taint with your guilt. Marco's hand tightened on the gun. But before he could pull again, Giovanni's phone, still in his other hand, began to buzz. Marco glanced down. A message flashed across the cracked screen. Incoming transfer complete. File broadcast. Worldwide. Giovanni's bloody smile widened. Too late. Marco froze. What did you do? I gave the world your secret. Marco's pulse spiked. He snatched the phone, scrolling. The video, the same one Elena had seen, was now live, streaming across encrypted channels, news networks, and the deep web. Every frame, every gunshot, every lie. Within an hour, Giovanni whispered, coughing blood. Every law enforcer, every rival family, every journalist will have it. Your empire will burn before dawn. The theater seemed to darken. Marco's grip loosened. He looked down at the man bleeding in his hands. A monster, yes, but one who had just destroyed him without firing a second shot. Giovanni met his gaze, breathing shallow. You built your throne on fire, DeLuca. Now drown in the smoke. Marco dropped him. The gun clattered to the floor. He turned away. His reflection fractured in the broken mirrors that lined the stage. For a moment, he just stood there, a man unmade. The rain poured harder, washing the blood from the floorboards, as if the city itself tried to erase what it had seen behind him. Giovanni slumped, his breath fading, but even dying. He smiled because he knew the truth. Sometimes revenge doesn't need a survivor. By dawn, Palermo was awake, screens lit up in cafes, alleys and police stations. The DeLuca name, once whispered in fear, now screamed across every headline. Mafia empire exposed. The fall of Marco DeLuca. The footage was everywhere. The world had chosen its villain, and Elena had vanished. Marco sat in his penthouse overlooking the harbor, the same city he had once owned now turning its back on him. His men were gone, his empire fractured overnight. But he didn't care about any of that. He only thought of her voice, her trembling hands. The way she had said don't. He replayed it endlessly in his head like punishment. The clock struck 9, somewhere far below. Sirens wailed. The law was coming, his enemies were coming, and still, he didn't move. Instead, he poured 2 glasses of wine. Red, rich, and heavy with memory. Point 1 for him, point 1 untouched. The same way it had always been since the night she left. He lifted the glass and whispered into the empty air. Forgive me, Elena, for everything I was, and everything I couldn't be. Then he drank. The taste burned, not like alcohol, but like confession. Outside, thunder cracked again, and somewhere far away a door opened. The kind that doesn't lead to safety but to truth, because Elena Rossi hadn't disappeared. She was coming back, and she wasn't coming alone. The cafe was quieter after he left, but the silence was heavy, like perfume that refused to fade. Elena's hands trembled as she wiped the counter again. Though it was already spotless, she told herself it was just the cold or the way his eyes had lingered a heartbeat too long. But the truth sat in her chest like thunder waiting to break that night. She couldn't sleep. She lay awake in her small apartment above the bookstore, the rain whispering against her window. The city murmured below. Scooters, sirens, the far-off cry of someone laughing too loudly into the night. She should have felt safe. She didn't. When she finally drifted into sleep, her dreams were strange. She saw the same man, sitting in a room of gold light and shadows, his back turned, smoke curling from his hand. She wanted to call his name, but she didn't know it, and when he turned to face her, the dream shattered. The next morning came dressed in fog. Palermo woke slow. Streets glistening, the air thick with the scent of rain and coffee. Elena arrived early, opened the cafe, and set about her routine. But when she reached for the open sign, her fingers paused midair, because across the street, a black car waited. Engine idling, silent as sin, the window tinted too dark to see through, yet she felt eyes on her watching. Measuring, her breath caught, then she looked away. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself she was being dramatic. But inside the car, Marco DeLuca was there, watching her through the rain-specked glass. He didn't know why he came. Maybe curiosity, maybe something else. He told himself it was precaution. That every person who crossed his path had to be understood, catalogued, dissected. Yet the truth was simpler, and more dangerous. She had looked at him like no one ever had, not with fear, not with worship, with something painfully human. Should we move in? The question came from the driver. Marco didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the woman inside. The way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The way she smiled at an old man buying his morning espresso, soft, unaware. A world untouched by violence. Finally he said, "No. Just watch." And the car melted into the rhythm of the street, blending into the blur of motion and rain. Days passed. She noticed the car again. Sometimes parked far, sometimes near, always silent, always watching, and yet strangely she didn't feel hunted. She felt, remembered, like someone had opened a door she didn't know was locked. What she didn't know was that somewhere in the city, people were beginning to whisper, that the boss of Palermo had started to change. He smiled more, or at least less grimly. He stayed out of the casinos and skipped meetings. His men noticed. His rivals noticed, and one of them, a man named Silvio Moretti, took notice too long because power in Palermo was a throne made of knives, and when a king faltered, even for love, there was always someone ready to bleed him for it. The city's heartbeat quickened, and in Palermo's underbelly, whispers moved faster than bullets. A king distracted was an opportunity, and Marco DeLuca, the man who once ruled with silence and fear, was beginning to hesitate. Silvio Moretti had been waiting for that. He sat in a smoky backroom of an old billiard bar, his gold chain glinting against his throat, the cue in his hand tapping rhythmically against the table around him. Laughter filled the air. Sharp, cruel, too loud to be real. He smiled, but his eyes were dark with calculation. "DeLuca's getting soft," he said, lighting a cigarette. "They say he's spending nights at some cafe downtown, watching a waitress serve croissants." The men around him laughed, but Silvio didn't. He leaned forward, eyes glinting under the low light. When men like him start looking at women like her, they forget where their guns are. And that's when you take their crown. Outside, rain gathered on the cobblestone. Palermo was listening. That evening, Elena closed up the cafe later than usual. She hummed softly under her breath, an old tune her mother used to sing. She didn't notice the man at the corner table who hadn't moved for an hour, didn't notice his eyes follow her reflection in the glass. When she turned off the lights and stepped out into the cool night, she felt it, that eerie prickle down her spine. Someone was watching. She looked around. Nothing but empty streets, shuttered windows, a dog barking somewhere in the distance. She told herself it was just nerves, but across the street, Silvio's man pressed the cigarette between his lips and murmured into his phone, "She's alone. Leaving now." Marco was in his penthouse, staring at the city through glass walls when the call came. "Boss, there's movement near the cafe. Moretti's boys." The glass of whiskey froze halfway to his lips. A heartbeat passed. Then his voice dropped, quiet but lethal. "Where exactly?" "Via Messina. 2 cars. No headlights." He didn't wait for more. The glass shattered as he set it down too hard. "Stay on them. Don't move until I get there." By the time he reached the car, his coat was still unbuttoned, rain slashing against his face. The engine roared to life, echoing through the empty streets. Elena walked faster. Her footsteps echoed in the narrow alley leading to her apartment. She clutched her purse tighter, heart thudding. The streetlights flickered behind her. Footsteps matched hers. Slow, deliberate. She turned a corner, nothing, then. A hand grabbed her arm. She gasped, spinning around. But before she could scream, headlights tore through the alley. A black car screeched to a stop, tires hissing against wet stone. The door opened. "Get in." Marco's voice cut through the rain, deep, sharp, and commanding. For a second, she froze. He took a step closer, his coat soaked, eyes burning through the darkness. "Now, Elena." The way he said her name, as if he'd known it forever, broke her paralysis. She slid into the car, trembling. The door slammed shut. Gunfire erupted behind them. Flashes of light, sharp cracks splitting the night. Marco's men returned fire from another car down the street. The engine roared as they sped away, rain streaking the windshield like silver scars. Elena pressed her hands to her chest, shaking. Marco drove without a word, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the road. For a long time there was only the storm, the hum of the tires, the sound of 2 hearts that didn't yet understand what had just begun. When they finally stopped under a bridge, the city lights blinking faintly in the distance, he turned to her, rain dripping from his hair, breath heavy with danger. "You're safe now," he said quietly. But even as he said it, his eyes betrayed the truth. She wasn't safe, not from them, not from him. Not from the world that would soon burn for what had just sparked between them. The rain softened into a whisper by the time they reached the edge of the old quartered, forgotten place. Half alive, half crumbling, where even the police pretended not to see. Marco pulled the car into a narrow archway, the engine growling low before falling silent. The air smelled of wet stone and danger. He stepped out first, scanning the shadows, then opened her door with emotion both protective and impatient. "Inside," he said. Elena followed, her heels clicking against the slick pavement, her breath clouding in the cold. She didn't ask where they were going. Only that strange instinct told her not to run. There was something in his silence. Something heavy, but not cruel. They passed through an iron gate and down a stairwell lit by a single bulb that buzzed faintly. The bottom was a door, steel unmarked, and when he opened it, the warmth of another world spilled out. It wasn't what she expected, no. Gold, no velvet, no decadent sin. just clean walls, a single lamp, a leather chair, and a wooden table with a chessboard half played. The room smelled faintly of tobacco and rained. He gestured toward the chair. Sit. She obeyed, her coat damp, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them on her lap. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, his movements deliberate, the kind of grace born from control. When he handed her one, their fingers brushed. Who were they? She asked softly. He didn't look at her. People who like to test their luck. And you? His eyes lifted then, sharp, unreadable. People don't test me twice. A flicker of fear crossed her face, but beneath it, something else. Curiosity. The kind that burns slow and dangerous. She sipped the drink. It burned her throat. He watched the way she swallowed, as though studying her was easier than trusting her. You shouldn't have been there alone, he said finally. I work late. It's my job. What job? Journalist. Local paper. He almost smiled, not with amusement but disbelief. You risk your life for ink. She looked at him, unflinching. You risk yours for power. The silence that followed was thick enough to breathe. For the first time, something like respect flickered in his eyes. Outside, thunder rolled again, slow and distant. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his shadow long against the light. You should stay here tonight. I can't. You can, he said quietly, almost gently. And you will. There was no threat in his voice, only inevitability. She nodded, unsure if she was agreeing out of fear or something more dangerous. He handed her a towel, then turned away to pour himself another drink. When she disappeared into the side room to dry off, he let out a slow exhale, rubbing his hand over his jaw. He hadn't meant to get involved. He hadn't meant to save her, but something in the way she... Dawn crept slowly across Palermo, bleeding pale gold through the clouds that still hung heavy with rain. The safe house stood quiet, hidden between warehouses that smelled of rust and salt. Inside, the air was thick, with silence, with questions, with a faint hum of danger that never really slept. Marco was already awake. He sat by the window, shirt unbuttoned at the throat, cigarette burning between his fingers. The smoke curled upward like ghosts trying to escape the ceiling. He hadn't slept. Men like him didn't dream, they remembered. Elena stirred on the couch, her hair spilling over the pillow, one arm dangling to the floor. The night had stripped away her defenses. For a moment she looked fragile, too human for the world she'd accidentally stepped into. Marco watched her, not out of lust but confusion. He'd saved her without thinking, and that frightened him more than the gunfire. He crushed the cigarette in the ashtray, stood, and crossed the room. When she opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was his silhouette against the window light. Broad shoulders, scar near his collarbone, eyes that carried both violence and silence. Morning, she murmured, sitting up, clutching the blanket closer. You talk in your sleep, he said, her brows furrowed. What did I say? He turned slightly, the faintest trace of a smirk ghosting his lips. Something about fire. And truth. She blinked, unsure if he was teasing. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe it was a warning. He poured coffee into 2 small cups, the bitter scent filling the air. She accepted hers carefully, their fingers brushing again. The smallest contact, but it sparked something neither could name. A knock shattered the quiet. 3 short raps, coded, measured. Marco's body tensed instantly. The softness vanished. The boss returned. He drew his gun and moved silently to the door. Elena, he said without turning. Stay behind the table. Her pulse quickened. He opened the door just enough to reveal a tall man in a black coat, Nico, his right hand. Boss, Nico muttered, stepping in. We found the ones who went after her. Moretti's crew. Marco's eyes narrowed. Alive. Ooh. For now. Keep them that way. His tone was flat, cold, final. Nico glanced at Elena, the curiosity in his look sharp and unhidden. You brought her here. Marco's gaze cut to him like a blade. You have a problem with that? Nico lifted his hands slightly. No, boss. Just not like you to bring civilians into our world. She's not part of this, Marco said. Elena's voice broke the tension. Apparently I am. Both men looked at her. She stood now, defiant despite the fear she tried to hide. You said they came for me. That makes me part of it, doesn't it? Marco studied her, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. You're alive because I made you part of it, he said softly. She didn't back down. Then maybe you should tell me why anyone would want to kill a journalist from a small paper. Silence. Nico looked away. Marco's jaw tightened. Finally, he said, because you saw something you weren't supposed to. Her heart stuttered. What are you talking about? The night before last, he said. The docks. You were there, taking photos. I was covering a shipping strike. He shook his head slowly. No. You were standing 20 meters from one of my trucks when it exploded. Someone wanted that cargo gone. And now they want you gone too. Her breath caught. The pieces began to click into place. You think I'm part of it? His eyes met hers. Dark, steady, dangerous. I think you're the only witness left. The words sank into her bones. Nico shifted uneasily. Boss, if she's seen what I think she's seen, I'll handle it, Marco cut him off. When Nico left, the room felt smaller. The silence between them stretched. Thick, heavy, full of unspoken things. Elena turned toward him, voice trembling. So what now? You keep me locked in here until whoever they are stop looking for me. He looked at her for a long moment, then quietly. Until I know you're not working for them. She stared, hurt flashing across her face. You saved me just to accuse me? I saved you because I don't like loose ends, he said. Though even he didn't sound convinced, she stood there, eyes glistening, the morning light washing over both of them. For a heartbeat, neither spoke, then she whispered, You don't know what kind of man you want to be, do you? And she walked away, her footsteps soft but cutting through the silence like a confession. Marco stayed still. For the first time in years, he didn't know if he was losing control, or finally beginning to feel alive. The rain had stopped, but the streets still glistened. Every puddle a mirror reflecting a city that hid its sins in daylight. Elena stood by the window, wrapped in Marco's shirt, staring out into the blurred skyline of Palermo. She didn't know what she feared more, the men chasing her or the man who had saved her behind her. Marco spoke quietly into his phone. His words were clipped, controlled, the tone of a man who had built empires on silence. Find out who leaked the shipment route, he said. And if Moretti's name comes up again, bury it. He ended the call, slipped the phone into his pocket, and looked at her. You didn't eat, he said. She turned, eyes tired. Not hungry. He studied her for a moment, the way her shoulders curved slightly forward, the way she avoided his gaze. Then, without another word, he walked into the adjoining kitchen and returned minutes later with a plate bread, cheese, few olives. Simple but real that he set it down in front of her. Eat. You'll need strength if you plan on surviving my world. She smiled faintly, not at the food but at the strange tenderness hidden beneath his roughness. You talk like it's a curse. It is. She picked at the bread, her voice quiet. Why do you stay in it then? He didn't answer immediately. Instead he walked to the window, the sunlight drawing sharp edges along his jawline. Because someone has to keep the wolves from eating the city, he said finally. And sometimes the only way to stop a wolf is to become one. His reflection in the glass looked like a ghost of all the choices he never unmade. Elena lowered her gaze. Maybe some wolves just need to rest. He turned then, eyes meeting hers, a flicker of something human surfacing before he forced it back down. Rest doesn't exist for men like me. She wanted to say something, but the door suddenly creaked open. Nico stepped in again, his expression grim. Boss, he said, we found the leak. Marco's body stilled. Who? Nico hesitated. It's one of ours. Enzo. For a second, the world seemed to narrow. Enzo, the kid Marco had raised from the streets, the one who'd taken a bullet for him years ago. Elena saw the change in Marco's face. Not anger but sorrow buried beneath iron. Where is he? Nico's voice dropped. He's asking to see you. Says he has something you need to hear. Marco exhaled slowly. Bring him to the docks. No one else. Nico nodded and left. The room fell silent again. Elena rose, voice low. You don't have to go. He looked at her, the hardness in his face softening for a breath. You think I can let betrayal breathe? She stepped closer. You think killing him will make it right? It'll make it quiet. And what happens after the quiet? She whispered. His eyes searched hers. You ask too many questions. Maybe because you give too many half-truths. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air was thick, not with threat, but with something far more dangerous. Connection. Then he turned away, grabbing his coat. Stay here. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me. Marco. He paused at the threshold. His hand on the handle, his voice dropped to a near whisper. You said wolves should rest. Maybe you'll teach me how when I come back. And then he was gone, swallowed by the morning light and the echo of his own ghosts. At the docks, the wind carried the smell of salt and betrayal. Enzo was on his knees, bound, blood dried along the corner of his mouth. He looked up when Marco approached, eyes hollow, voice rough. Boss, he rasped. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Marco stopped a few feet away. You sold me out to Moretti. I didn't sell you out, Enzo said. I was trying to save you. Marco's hand tightened around the gun. Save me. Enzo nodded weakly. The shipment, it wasn't what you thought. There were files in it. Counts. Someone inside the family is feeding Interpol. I tried to warn you, but Moretti. A gunshot cracked the air. That Enzo's words died with him. Marco didn't pull the trigger. He turned sharply toward the shadows, fury igniting behind his eyes. Nico. Nico lowered his smoking gun, face unreadable. He talked too much. Marco stepped forward, his voice low and venomous. He wasn't finished. Nico shrugged. He was a traitor, boss. You said it yourself. Betrayal can't breathe. For a long moment, Marco just stared at him, the sea crashing behind them. Then he said quietly, Maybe I was wrong. He turned and walked away, the storm inside him louder than the waves. Back at the safe house, Elena sat alone, staring at the door. Something in her chest ached, the kind of ache that warns you the story isn't about to end, it's about to begin. And far across the harbor, Marco DeLuca, the man who never doubted, was beginning to realize that the world he built on loyalty was starting to crack. The night returned with a silence that didn't feel like peace. It felt like a warning, the kind that sits heavy in the bones before something breaks. Marco drove without a destination. The city stretched around him. Golden lights, narrow streets, 1,000 windows pretending not to see it. He could still hear the echo of Enzo's voice in his head. There were files in the shipment. Someone inside the family is feeding Interpol. He should have dismissed it. Lies from a dying man. But something about the way Enzo had looked at him, not afraid but desperate, refused to fade when he finally stopped the car. He was outside the safe house again. The engine ticked softly as it cooled. He sat there for a long time, staring at the building, at the one window where faint light glowed behind the curtain inside. Elena hadn't slept either. She'd spent the hours pacing, listening to the distant thunder rolling over the sea. Every few minutes, she looked at the clock. Every few minutes, she thought he wouldn't come back. When she finally heard the door open, she didn't move. He stepped in quietly, rain dripping from his coat, the weight of another life pressing down on him. You're bleeding, she said softly. He glanced down, a cut along his hand, dried but raw. Not mine. Her eyes searched his face. Did you kill him? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Elena took a step closer, her voice trembling. You don't have to keep doing this. He met her gaze, tired but steady. You think it's that simple. I think you want it to be. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The room was full of words neither dared to say. Then he walked past her, toward the desk in the corner, the one lined with ledgers, maps, and files sealed with wax. He pulled one open, scanning the pages until he found what he was looking for. There, a name circled in red ink, Enzo's handwriting, single word beneath it. Aurora. He frowned. What the hell? Elena stepped closer, peering over his shoulder. Aurora. He turned slightly. Means nothing to you. She hesitated. It's familiar. Marco looked at her sharply. How familiar. Her pulse quickened. She didn't want to say it, but the memory rose anyway. Her father's voice years ago, hushed and urgent. If you ever hear the name Aurora, run. It's not a person. It's a shadow. She swallowed hard. My father used to mention it. Said it wasn't safe. Marco's eyes darkened. Your father, what did he do? He was an accountant, she said. At least that's what he told me. Marco turned back to the file, flipping through the pages faster now. There were offshore accounts, code names, shipments disguised as charity donations, and a signature. Rossi, his hands froze. He looked at her. Elena, this signature. This is your father's name. Her breath caught. That's impossible. It's right here. Marco's voice softened. Who told you that? Her lips parted, but no sound came out. For the first time, she realized she didn't actually know. There'd been a closed casket, a quiet funeral, a letter from some hospital she'd never verified. The ground beneath her memory began to crack. Marco leaned forward, lowering his tone. If your father worked for Aurora, and Aurora was tied to my shipments, then whoever came after you wasn't just hunting a journalist. He paused, the truth forming slowly between them. They were finishing what started years ago. Elena backed away, her heartbeat loud in her ears. You think my father was one of you? No, Marco said quietly. I think he was worse. I think he was one of us who tried to leave. The words hung there, heavy, final. Outside, lightning flashed over the bay. The wind rattled the shutters like a warning whispered in an old language. Elena sat down slowly, her hands trembling. All this time, I thought he died of a heart attack. Marco watched her, something almost like pity in his eyes. In our world, no one dies of a heart attack. Silence, then barely audible, she said. Then who killed him? Marco didn't answer, but deep inside, a single possibility twisted like a knife, one he wasn't ready to speak aloud, because if he was right, the man who ordered her father's death wasn't Moretti. It was someone much closer. Someone who still called him boss. Elena didn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the paper again. Her father's name in his familiar, careful handwriting, stamped onto blood-moneyed BY morning. The rain had stopped. But the silence between her and Marco hadn't. He stood by the window, shirt half unbuttoned, a cigarette burning to ash between his fingers. She finally spoke, voice low. If you think my father worked for this, Aurora, then I need to know everything. Marco didn't turn. Knowing everything doesn't save you. It only changes what kills you. Then let it change it, she said. I'm not running again. That made him look at her. For the first time there was something new in his eyes. Not anger, not control. Respect. He nodded once. Fine. But if we do this, we do it my way. She gave a small, sharp nod. Your way then. He stubbed out the cigarette. Aurora wasn't a person. It was an operation. A financial web used to hide the Moretti family's money when the government froze their accounts. But it wasn't Moretti's idea. It started inside my own house. Inside your house. He leaned on the window frame, jaw tightening. My brother, Matteo. Elena blinked. You have a brother. Had, Marco said. We built the syndicate together. I handled the streets. He handled the numbers. He was the smart one. But he got greedy. Thought he could launder the money through clean fronts and cut me out. That's when Aurora was born. He paused, eyes cold. When I found out, I confronted him. He disappeared a week later. No body. No trace. The only thing I found was an encrypted ledger. The one Enzo mentioned before he died. Elena frowned. So Enzo was part of it. Maybe, Marco said. But Enzo was loyal. He might have been trying to warn me. He turned and looked at her. And if your father's name was on those accounts, then Matteo didn't disappear. He went underground. And he used your father to do it. Elena felt her stomach twist. You think my father helped him hide the money? I think your father found out who he was really working for, and tried to expose it. And they killed him, she finished, voice shaking. Marco nodded slowly. Which means if Mateo's still alive, he's the one who sent men after you. The air between them turned sharp, electric. Everything suddenly made sense. The attack, the threats, the men at the docks, Elena whispered. He's been watching me all this time. Marco's expression hardened. Not anymore. He walked to a steel locker in the corner, opened it, and pulled out a pistol. Heavy, black, cleaned. He checked the magazine, then holstered it under his coat. Elena stood. What are you doing? Finishing it. You're going after him alone. He gave her a quick, thin smile. No. I'm going after him with a reason I never had before. Before she could stop him, he was already at the door. Elena reached out, grabbed his arm. Marco. He turned, eyes burning with the kind of calm that always comes before violence. Promise me, she said. If you find him, don't kill him until I know the truth. For a moment, his jaw flexed. Then he nodded once. I promise. He left without another word. As the door closed behind him, Elena looked down at the open file again, at the cold trail of numbers, names, and codes. Something inside her hardened. She wasn't going to wait for Marco to come back. If Matteo Rossi had destroyed her family once, she was going to finish what her father started, with or without the Mafia's protection. The city woke under a gray sky, cold, heavy, and expectant, like it knew something was about to break. Elena walked fast through the morning crowd, her coat drawn tight, her pulse sharp in her ears. She had taken the file from Marco's desk before leaving. Just one copy. Hidden between the folds of her bag, somewhere in those numbers, her father's truth waited. She stopped at an old printing shop on Via San Gregorio, a place that once published underground newspapers during the war. The owner, an old friend of her father, looked up from behind the counter. Elena Rossi, he said quietly. You look too much like trouble for this early in the morning. I need your help, Signor Luca. My father's files. You remember how he coded things? The man sighed, motioned for her to follow him to the back room. He always hid messages in bank ledgers and articles, Luca said. Said if you want to tell the truth, you have to bury it under the lies. He slid her a cup of bitter espresso and opened the folder. Lines of numbers, columns of names, and one note scrawled faintly in pencil. Lighthouse. Elena leaned in. What's that mean? Luca rubbed his chin. Could be a location. There's an old lighthouse at Porto Antico, abandoned since the fire 10 years ago. Maybe he hid something there. Her pulse quickened. If he did, that's where the answers are. Be careful, the old man said softly. Your father always said the truth burns brighter than anyone expects. Elena smiled faintly, but her eyes were fierce. Then it's time to set it on fire. Meanwhile, across the city, Marco stood in the upper floor of an old warehouse that smelled of oil and gunpowder. His men had gathered. Silent, waiting, he placed a photo of Matteo on the table. Younger, smiling, a ghost frozen in better days. We've confirmed movement, one of his men said. A man matching Matteo's description was seen in the docks district. He's not alone, he's got soldiers. Marco stared at the photograph, the corner of his mouth tightening. Then he's not hiding anymore. Another man shifted uneasily. Boss, if Matteo's alive. You sure you want to do this? He's your blood. Marco looked up, eyes like cold iron. He stopped being my blood the day he spilled it. He holstered his gun, turned toward the window where the sea glimmered faintly under the clouds. I'll end this before anyone else gets dragged into it. He didn't know, not yet, that Elena was already heading to the same place. The lighthouse, the graveyard of everything they'd lost. By afternoon, the clouds broke. Elena reached the edge of Porto Antico, where waves crashed against blackened rocks. The lighthouse stood tall and broken. Its windows shattered, its door hanging by a single hinge. Inside, the air was damp, thick with the scent of salt and rust. She lit a small flashlight and moved through the spiral stairwell. Her steps echoing softly halfway up, she stopped, a faint noise above her. A creak her breath caught. Who's there? Silence. Then a voice, calm and amused. You shouldn't have come alone. She froze. The flashlight trembled in her hand from the shadows. A man stepped forward. Dark coat, gray hair, and eyes sharp as glass. Matteo Rossi, her father's betrayer. Marco's brother. You look like him, Matteo said. The journalist. The idealist. You both loved truth too much. Her heart pounded. You killed him. He smiled faintly. No, I used him. He found what I needed, the names, the accounts, but he refused to sell them. So I gave his discovery a new author. His death made the story believable. Elena's breath broke. You made him a martyr. He stepped closer. History remembers martyrs. It forgets fools. Her hand went to her coat pocket, the small pistol Marco had left in the drawer. Matteo noticed, smiled. Ah, he gave you a gun. How poetic. My brother always did like broken things. The floorboards creaked again, then, a voice from behind Matteo, low and deadly. And I always finish what you start. Matteo turned. Marco stepped out of the shadows, rain dripping from his coat, gun already drawn. For the first time in years, the two brothers faced each other, no words. No excuses. Just silence and ghosts. Elena's flashlight flickered outside. The storm returned. Point two brothers. Point one truth. And a woman who carried both their fates in her trembling hands. The air inside the lighthouse was thick with salt, fear, and memories. Rain pressed against the broken windows, running down the cracked walls like veins of an old wound refusing to heal. Marco's shadow stretched long across the floorboards, the barrel of his gun steady. Not on Elena, but on Matteo. Matteo smirked. So the ghost finally walks into the dark. His voice was soft, almost theatrical. You were always the family's favorite son, Marco. The dutiful heir. The one father called the empire's future. Tell me, did you ever wonder what it felt like to be the one left in the cold? Marco didn't answer. His silence was its own sentence, carved in restraint, tempered by too many years of vengeance. He stepped closer, boots echoing against wood. You killed him, Marco said quietly. Our father. At the wedding. Matteo's smile flickered. He made his choice. He chose you over me. You got the business, the loyalty, the throne. Got the scraps. So I took what I deserved. Elena's breath trembled in the dark. The flashlight quivered in her grip, spilling light over both men, one born of fury, the other of regret. DeMarco's voice dropped lower, each word weighed with pain. You took everything. You turned our name into a grave. Matteo spread his arms, stepping into the beam of light. And yet here you are, doing the same thing, one body at a time. You call it loyalty. Call it survival. Maybe we're not so different. Elena's whisper sliced through the storm. You're wrong. Both men turned. You destroyed people for power, she said. He kills to protect it. The difference is blood doesn't make you family. Choices do. Matteo looked at her, something unreadable in his eyes. Ah, the journalist. Always writing tragedies. Marco's finger tightened on the trigger. End this, Matteo. Now. But Matteo only laughed, a sound too hollow to be human. And? No, brother. This is where it begins. From behind the rusted staircase, footsteps emerged. Two of Matteo's men, guns drawn. Elena gasped. Marco turned just as the first shot rang out. Wood splintered, metal screamed. He dove behind a pillar, dragging Elena down with him as bullets shredded the air. The storm outside roared like a dying beast, glass shattered. The lighthouse groaned under the weight of chaos. Marco fired once. Clean, efficient. One man fell, the other lunged forward. Marco's bullet caught him mid-stride. Silence again. Except for the rain. Then came Matteo's voice, hoarse, bitter, echoing from above the stairwell. Still the perfect soldier. Still the obedient son. You think killing me will cleanse you? Marco rose slowly, gun still steady. I don't want to cleanse anything. I just want it to stop. He began to climb. Each step creaked under his boots, each breath heavier than the last. Elena followed, against fear, against reason. Matteo stood near the broken lantern room, the wind howling through shattered glass, the sea raging below. Lightning painted his face, half shadow, half guilt. You know, he said, voice trembling now, I didn't kill father to destroy the family. I did it to save it. He was going to sell us out. Hand the DeLuca name to the government, make us puppets for his peace. Marco stopped a few steps below. The revelation hit like a blade. That's a lie. Is it? Matteo whispered. He wanted to dismantle everything. Start over. He said we had too much blood on our hands. He wanted freedom. But we don't get freedom, brother. We only inherit cages. The gun in Marco's hand lowered. Not from mercy, but confusion. Elena's eyes widened behind him, the rain soaking through her hair, her heart torn between both men. Then Matteo stepped closer to the window. You see? The truth doesn't set you free. It just replaces one prison with another. He smiled sadly. Tell Elena I'm sorry. Before Marco could move, Matteo turned and stepped backward through the broken glass. Swallowed by wind and seed, a scream ripped from Elena's throat. Marco lunged forward, but the night had already claimed his brother. Only the echo of thunder answered. He stood there, frozen, staring into the storm, the gun hanging useless at his side. Elena placed her hand on his arm. The same hand that had once saved him from his own emptiness, and in that fragile touch, the Empire felt smaller than a heartbeat. Rain bled through the shattered glass and ran down Marco's face, mingling with the sweat and the tears he didn't notice. He stood there long after the sea had swallowed the last trace of Matteo. The lighthouse creaked around him, every gust of wind, pushing at the broken windows like the ghosts of all the things he'd failed to keep alive. Elena was beside him but didn't speak. She just watched him breathe. Ragged, heavy, as though each breath was borrowed from a man who no longer wanted it. When he finally turned to her, the fury was gone. What remained was the quiet, hollow ache of someone who'd spent his entire life holding the world together by violence and had finally watched it fall apart. Outside, the storm softened. The sky broke open with pale morning light. The sea no longer raged. It only whispered as if it too had run out of strength. Marco dropped the gun. It hit the wooden floor with a dull metallic sigh. He looked at his hands, steady now though they trembled inside. Every time I think I've buried the past, he said softly, it finds a way to crawl back and stand in front of me. Elena didn't move closer. She knew there was nothing to say that could unmake the years or the pain or the blood, so she simply said, then maybe it's time to stop digging graves. Her words hung between them. He almost smiled, but it came out broken. They left the lighthouse together. The road back to Palermo was long and washed out. The world looked the same, yet it wasn't. Like the city itself knew what had been lost and refused to look them in the EYT dawn. They reached his estate on the hill. The guard stepped aside without a word. Marco walked straight past them, into the dining room that still held 2 empty glasses of wine from nights he no longer wanted to remember. He poured another .1 for himself, .1 untouched. The ritual had become a kind of penance, a way of pretending that something sacred still existed in the ruins. Elena watched him from the doorway, her coat still wet, her eyes softer than he deserved. You don't have to do this anymore, she said. The Empire, the war, the ghosts. Marco lifted the glass but didn't drink. If I stop, he said, what am I? You're a man who's still alive. He looked up, and for a moment there was a flicker. Something human, something old, then it vanished again. She walked closer, took the glass from his hand, set it down beside the other. Let the dead drink alone, she whispered. The clock on the wall ticked. Outside, the first light of morning spread across the city, catching on rooftops, on marble statues, on the silent river of cars that marked the start of another day. Marco sat, elbows on the table, staring at the 2 glasses like they might answer him. Elena turned away and opened the window. The air smelled of wet stone and sea salt behind her. His voice came low, almost to himself. I don't know how to live without the fight. Then learn, she said. One day at a time. The words landed somewhere inside him, not deep enough to heal, but deep enough to stay. She left him there with the rising sun and the sound of the city waking, because some silences needed to last before anything could be rebuilt. For days, the DeLuca estate felt like a mausoleum dressed in silk. The men still reported for duty, the cars still arrived and departed, the money still moved, but the pulse was gone. Marco no longer shouted commands or signed orders with that precise, ruthless calm. He just watched from the balcony, letting the city spin without him. Tonight, he'd sit in his father's old chair, listening to the echoes of the empire he'd built out of fear, every sound in the house, A footstep, a door creak, a soft voice from the kitchen, came like a memory wearing someone else's skin. He thought of Matteo's final smile, of the way Elena had whispered learn like it was a command wrapped in mercy. Elena stayed for a while, working quietly from the study. Her articles began to appear again in the Palermo Gazette. Pieces about loss, about forgiveness, about cities that rebuild after storms. People read them and never guessed they were written by a woman who had once held a gun in her trembling hand inside a ruined lighthouse. Sometimes she'd find Marco by the window, the same untouched glass of wine beside him. He didn't drink anymore. He just stared at it like it was the ghost of who he'd been. One evening, she stood beside him and said, "You could start again, Marco. Use what you have to build, not destroy." He turned to her slowly. "I wouldn't know how. You learn by trying." The light from the setting sun fell across his face, catching the faint scars that time and war had left there. Something inside him shifted. Not redemption, but the first faint movement toward it. The next morning, he called his consigliera. "Sell the docks. The weapons routes. Close the shipments. Boss. Do it. I'm done." There was panic in the ranks, confusion in the streets. Rivals whispered that DeLuca had gone soft. Some planned to test it. He let them come, and when they did, he didn't send men. He sent words. Meetings instead of executions. Deals instead of wars. It wasn't mercy. It was exhaustion turned into wisdom. That a month passed. Then another. Elena began packing her things. She had an offer to write in Milan, a fresh start she couldn't refuse. The night before she left, they stood in the courtyard where Jasmine climbed the old stone walls. "I used to think love was fire," she said. "That it had to burn to be real." He looked at her, his eyes softer than she'd ever seen. "And now I think love is the thing that survives after the fire's gone." She smiled then, the first unbroken smile since that night in the rain, and placed her hand on his chest. "Goodbye, Marco." He wanted to ask her to stay, but he didn't, because for the first time, he understood that letting someone go could also be an act of love when she was gone. He walked back inside. The table waited, 2 glasses side by side. He poured the wine again, one for himself, one untouched, and this time he lifted both. "To the dead," he said quietly, "and to the living who keep trying." He drank one, poured the other into the earth outside, where the rain would soon fall again. Palermo breathed around him, the city lights flickering like old promises. Somewhere, church bells rang, and in that soft hour before dawn, Marco DeLuca, once a name spoken only in fear, closed his eyes and let the silence come without fighting it, because the empire was gone, the war was over, and for the first time in his life, the Mafia boss was just a man who had finally learned how to stop killing everything he loved. Some stories don't end with a bullet. They end with silence. And the weight of everything left unsaid. Marco DeLuca was never just a name. He was every scar, every promise, every truth spoken too late. Elena's words still echo through Palermo's streets. "Let the dead drink alone." And now, as the rain falls and the city breathes, we leave you with the echoes of their story. If you enjoyed this cinematic journey, don't forget to subscribe to Mafia Hearts, like this video, and comment below. Tell us where you're watching from and which part of the story touched you the most. Your support helps bring more stories like this to life.